Thank you so much to the three of you and to Jonathan for being willing to stand up here and share, just open up and share yourselves with us. That is not an easy thing to do. And I'd love to do another round of applause and appreciation for them. Yasmin's not in the room, right? Just want to make sure. Okay. We really do appreciate you. I think all of us have a goal to be more survivor-centered in our work, and the best way to do that is to listen to survivors, right? So I really do appreciate you all being here. We are a little bit ahead schedule, which is not a problem. That's fantastic. So I am going to bring up our next speakers, and because we're a little early, I want to make sure that the three of them are in the room. You're all sitting together. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to introduce our next session, which is going to be a really helpful, eye-opening conversation, I think. Let me see, show of hands, how many of you are on the DV side? Okay, a lot of you. So you're all familiar with VOCA? Okay, and how many of you are on the healthcare side or other spaces that maybe are not as familiar with VOCA? Okay, so this is going to be a really enriching conversation around the Victims of Crime Act funding and some of the recent cuts in that funding and what that really means for survivors, survivor-centered care, and for programs that support and serve survivors. So I'm going to bring up Krista, and then Krista, you're going to introduce your folks, right? Okay, so Krista Kalan is the Senior Director of Public Policy at the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, CPEDV, or what we call the Partnership. And she oversees the organization's legislative budget and systems change advocacy. In her nearly 12 years at the partnership, she's successfully advocated for over $100 million in new funding for DV programs and prevention programs, and secured the passage of legislation to addressing the wide ranges of issues impacting survivors. Her work touches on economic justice, housing and homelessness, prevention, immigration, and alternatives to the criminal legal system. In addition to her legislative advocacy, Krista supports the home cohort of DV organizations, which strives to improve the safety and economic security of women, children, and gender-expansive people across California who are experiencing homelessness due to DV. Prior to joining the partnership, she was the public policy coordinator at the National Network to End DV, where her work focused on advocating for increases in federal funding for domestic and sexual violence programs and reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. So we're so lucky to have her here with us. And she's like the best person who's got her finger on the pulse of what's going on with all of this. So I'm going to pass the mic over to you.
Thank you so much. You know, you never realize just how long your bio is until you have to sit here while someone else reads it. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask my two fellow panelists to come on up. I will introduce you briefly as you walk up. So we have Amanda Gold from the Los Angeles LGBT Center and the National, I'm going to get it wrong, but the National Technical Assistance Provider on Intimate Partner Violence within the LGBT community. And we have Janine Williams joining us from Cal OES, the Office of Emergency Services, also known as the people who give you all a lot of money on the DV side. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm going to let you both do a little bit better of an intro for yourselves if you'd like to. And I think we have mics for both of you.
Hi, folks. My name is Amanda Gould. My pronouns are she, they. I'm the Senior Program Manager for the National LGBTQ Institute on Intimate Partner Violence. We are a project of the Los Angeles LGBT Center, which is both a federally qualified health center and also a domestic violence service provider, providing wraparound case management, mental health support, and legal advocacy for LGBTQ plus survivors.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Janine Williams. I am the Interpersonal Violence and Underserved Victims Division Chief at the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. So in the division that I oversee, we have the Domestic Violence Unit, the Sexual Assault Unit, and the Underserved Victims Unit. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you both. We'll get our act together. I promise. We'll do it. Okay, we got it. 3 mics. Figured it out. We're going to make these slides a little better, but I think I'm going to hand it off to Amanda to get us started. And really appreciate the introduction reminder that not everyone in this room works in a domestic violence organization, and therefore you haven't all heard me talk about VOCA all day, every day for the past year, so we'll do some basic grounding as well. Do you want to go to the next slide
first? All right, so, sorry. So what is VOCA? VOCA is the Victims of Crime Act, and VOCA supports a wide range of crime victim services and support services. So this can look like everything from legal advocacy, legal representation. It can look like housing assistance and housing access, shelters, case management, therapy, support groups, all the amazing services we heard about in our last panel that really are life-saving and essential to survivors across the country. So funding for VOCA funds the CVF, or Crime Victims Fund, and is one of the primary pots of funding that survivors across this country rely on in order to access support services. So you often will hear VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, FIPSA, the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, and VOCA is that third pot of funding that's essential to funding, keeping the lights on and doors open for domestic violence service providers, sexual assault service providers, child abuse treatment centers, and more, and culturally specific programs like ours at the Los Angeles LGBT Center.
Great. I'd also add that this is not traditional taxpayer money, so it comes in through federal fines and fees and criminal penalties, which means that it's uneven, right? It's not a guaranteed amount every single day coming into the fund, which is important, and we'll talk about. Amanda, do you want to talk a bit about funding decreases as well and what we've seen? Do you want me to? Okay. All right. So as I said, this is a pot of funding that comes from these criminal penalties, largely on corporations. And the deposits have been dropping pretty steadily since, about 2018 was the high water mark on the balance within the fund. And we've been seeing these deposits decline for a number of reasons. Some of them are super technical about how these cases get resolved. And so legislation was passed in 2021 to try to resolve that. But as you can see on the screen, the fund balance has dropped pretty substantially. And it's been in this challenging place where we need to keep releasing, really over $2 billion every single year to fund victim services at the level that we want to see. But the deposits haven't been keeping up with that. Right, and so we all know that pressure when the amount of money coming in isn't quite meeting what you need to spend, but certain expenses you still got to spend. And so Congress gets to every year decide how much to let out of the fund. And they're looking at this number, seeing the fund balance get lower, and they've been decreasing how much they've been letting out. So from 2018, they let out $4.436 billion. This year, 1.353. It's the lowest number we've seen in a decade. California received less than $100 million for the first time since 2014. The funds, I should say, come out to the states through a formula. It's a base amount plus population. So California is the biggest state, so we get the biggest amount, which is great. But when the cuts happen, we feel it to a much larger extent. And because of these declines, and Janine, please chime in too, we were facing a 44.7% cut to grant amounts of any grant that was funded with VOCA. So grants that were fully funded through VOCA, some grants are partially funded through VOCA. So this is, just as context for the healthcare and other field folks, this is what all your DV programs have been spending the last year really concerned about, right? Thanks to Cal OES, we had advance notice of almost a year that these cuts could be happening, which has been really helpful, but also has meant a year of worry for programs. So just want to lay that context. If you've been feeling like, well, the DV programs in my community are really stressed more than usual, this is probably some of it. Amanda, do you want to talk about what we've been doing to try to boost some funding?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have been looking at both federal solutions and state level solutions. So on a federal level, that we supported with the introduction of the Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act. Krista and I went to DC actually and met with legislators trying to advocate for the needs of survivors and talking about how essential this funding is to try and change hearts and minds to really protect survivor funding, because we can't afford to balance the budget on survivors' backs. At the same time, requesting on a state level, both looking at this current year and making sure we're protecting immediately keeping lights on at survivor service providers, but also looking at long-term solutions and how do we prevent having to go back year after year to ask for the same financial assistance when the CVF is running low. How do we come up with a safeguard in California to have funding that we can fall back on? And also the mechanisms to automatically make sure that California is prioritizing survivor service funding rather than having to operate in this crisis mode of trying to explain to legislators again and again how critical and life-saving this services is.
And let's do some good news for a minute. The state really heard us, really heard all of you. And this year in the budget for the fiscal year that just started July 1, they included $103 million in one-time funding to make sure that things stayed stable for this year, which is a huge deal. So who in here made calls, came to lobby days, bugged your legislator? Anybody? I know some of you did. So thank you. This was how we were able to do this. We also had legislation. We had one bill that didn't move forward that would have basically said anytime VOCA drops below a certain threshold, the state has to provide supplement. That didn't go through, but what did get signed on Friday is a brand new bill to create a new California penalty on corporations convicted of a crime to fund victim services here in California. You guys are the first group we get to celebrate with. I'm very excited. All right, class dismissed, session over, we're done. We're gonna end on that. This is a long-term piece to what Amanda was saying. This bill's going to take a while before we see money, right? It doesn't go into effect until January 1. Corporations have to commit some crimes after January 1 and get caught and get prosecuted and pay up. So it'll take time. This is not an immediate solution, but we know from being in this crisis, we need both immediate and long-term solutions. So this has been a very good news kind of moment. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it can't be overstated how devastating the impacts of these funding cuts can be and already are. As we are hearing from programs across the country of having to scale back on emergency housing options, so that's rental assistance, security deposit, moving costs. Shelters are having to make decisions about whether to close their doors or not. Organizations are having to lay off staff. Is for those of us in the domestic violence movement, we know our field is underfunded and overwhelmed. And advocates are operating on very low budgets, getting paid far too little with too many clients. We can't afford to be laying off more staff. We're seeing increased wait time for services. So this looks like a survivor of sexual assault in the hospital waiting for a survivor advocate maybe for hours to arrive on the scene because there's just not enough advocates because of the lack of funding. And decrease for culturally specific services for survivors is really big and important to us at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. Is we know, unfortunately, many LGBTQ survivors do not go to traditional domestic violence service providers. They go to LGBTQ community centers because that's what they know and trust, right? And it's not just specific to the LGBTQ community. It's many marginalized communities trust culturally specific and underserved community-specific resources. And we rely on VOCA-specific funding to be able to fund our crime victim services for LGBTQ survivors, including legal advocacy and case management and mental health care. Even we operate one of only 2 LGBTQ-specific batterers intervention programs in the country. And then cuts in legal aid and resources to survivors is, again, those of us who operate in the domestic violence field know how strapped we are for legal resources and how terrifying it is to self-represent in court, not knowing what you're going to face, not having legal representation or even legal advocacy or advice. And so those resources are so essential.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay. So I'm going to hand it over to Janine to talk through this from the Cal OES funder perspective.
Thank you, and I commend you both for all of the hard work that you guys do to try to keep doors open and keep the money and advocating at the Capitol. Cal OES can't get themselves involved with all of that, but definitely commend you all for your advocacy efforts. So these slides are kind of showing you what Krista and Amanda were just talking about. So in 2018, well, let's first, is it me? So like Krista stated, 10 years ago, the VOCA fund was $51 million. And then in 2015, that's me. Can you guys hear me? All right. I used to be a cheerleader, so. And then it shot up to 232 million, and it's like, oh my gosh, we have all this money, what are we gonna do? But I do wanna show, and then in 2018, the highest was 396 million. And because our federal funds were able to spend them for 3 to 4 years, and then even with COVID, we had some extra extensions. And so when you look at this chart, the money immediately started going down right after 2018. But because we had so much, we were able to keep all of our programs at the same level. It's only now that the money's not there anymore. It had continually went down, and now it's not there. And so unfortunately, through my fearless leader, Lee Bills, like Krista was stating, we started to get the VOCA steering committee together a year ago to say, what is our plan going to be, unfortunately, because it's happening. It's not, we can't say it's not happening. We can't ignore that it was happening, and we had to come up with a plan. And unfortunately, the plan hit all of the great programs that we were able to establish when the money was high. Can we keep going? Thank you. So yeah, this year it was 87 million, lowest we've seen in a long time. And these are the programs if you're looking this way on my right side of the non-competitive programs, those are our ongoing programs. Some of those programs are in statute to continue, and some of them are programs that we have just decided are good programs that we need to always continue. And those programs were going to stay in place, but they took a between 30 and 40% cut, and it kind of depends on if it was solely VOCA funded or if it had other funds that were also funded in the programs as well. And then the competitive programs are programs that we have for 5 funding cycles. So we say, for 5 years, you're going to get this money. So we said, okay, well, there's the area where, unfortunately, the reduction plan that was decided with the VOCA steering committee was those are the programs that we're going to have to start decreasing the amount of subawards. And so this year is when we started to see those reductions. As they go competitive, the amount of grant subawards that we give out is being decreased. And so as you can see, these programs, specialized housing, domestic violence housing first, victim advocacy and detention facilities, these were gaps in services that we were able to fulfill through when we had the money. And this is the unfortunate downfall of that decrease of the VOCA fund. And this shows the percentage of the funds that we had for our ongoing programs and then the percentage of funds for our newer programs. And then this is the combined focus areas of what we were able to fund when we had the money is 40% domestic violence and the human trafficking, gang violence, elder abuse, sexual violence, and child abuse. And so this is the reduction program. At this time, we were saying it was the possible reduction, and then it happened, and it became the actual reduction. And this is just exactly what I had already said, that we're reducing the competitive programs by 45% as they naturally go competitive. So we weren't going to do it until they go competitive. And that we were reducing the subrecipients for the ongoing program, their funds. And then what helped with that was the $103 million that you all advocated for. We were able to keep everybody at the same level this year. And then the county victim services program ended because that was always meant to be one-time funding.
Not done quite yet. I'll keep our contact info up just so you have it, but we wanted to talk about what all this means as we go forward. So we're going to facilitate ourselves for a little Q&A of each other, and then we're going to open it up to all of you for questions.
Okay, so I'll kick us off. I have to use the microphone because I was never a cheerleader, but I'm duly impressed. Oh, mic's fixed. Oh, very exciting. Thank you. So our presentation shared where we have been over the last year and prior. And since the title of our session is looking forward in terms of protecting VOCA funding, what is the current status of VOCA funding as we move forward?
So we're going to need Janine's cheerleading skills. So let me start with what's going on with the fund, and then I'll talk about what's going on with Congress and actually passing funding bills. So the Crime Victims Fund, as we've said, relies on these deposits from criminal settlements. There are 2 pretty hefty deposits that have been anticipated. One is against Binance. They're a crypto company. I don't know. I don't know anything about them other than that they have a big settlement coming in. Unfortunately, there are 2 lawsuits holding up the Binance settlement and another settlement. And these are lawsuits really challenging where the funds from the settlements against these corporations should go. And in particular, the plaintiffs are saying that these funds should go into a separate fund the federal government administers for victims of terrorism. Right, so it's a debate about where the money should go. So the Office on Victims of Crime, who administers the Crime Victims Fund, has accepted these deposits, but it has agreed not to use them until at least November 15th. So if you look at the balance for the fund, it looks pretty great because the money is technically there. So that is one big piece of the puzzle. They also, at least as of an update from the department director, still have to obligate money for the federal fiscal year that ends today. So as of the update the OVC director gave earlier this month, there's only $274 million in unencumbered money in the fund. So total in the fund is over $3 billion, but they still need to pay out for this fiscal year that ends today for the federal government, and they can't touch a big chunk of money because of these two lawsuits. So the fund balance is not great. At the same time, federal fiscal year ends today, so in theory, we would have a new federal budget for the next full fiscal year. That did not happen, which never really happens by September 30th. So Congress has passed a short-term spending bill through the middle of December to get through the November election, come back in, a short lame duck session, and hopefully pass a final federal funding bill. They may not get it done in December. They may do another short-term bill into early 2025. The same thing happened last year, right? This is not unusual. It wasn't until March of 2024 that Congress finalized their numbers. So the good news is that Congress does seem to want to fund these programs. So the Senate included $1.9 billion out of the VOCA fund in their bill. It hasn't, cleared the House. It's not final, but they have a pretty good number. Even the House's number was higher than this year's. So this year was $1.35 billion. They were saying 1.5. So either number is better. We obviously like 1.9 billion more than anything else. So how that is going to play into what's going on with these lawsuits and the fund balance kind of remains to be seen. So I'd say at the federal level, things are precarious, which means we're not really waiting for the federal government. From an advocacy perspective, we've already started talking to the Department of Finance at the state level. They're well aware. We've started talking to the legislature's budget committee, so they're well aware that this continues to be a continued need and that the federal number may not be anywhere near where we need it to be, and that state action is likely to be needed again.
And I concur. The programs that we administer need about $200 million to be able to sustain them. So with VOCA coming in at $87 million or even possibly $95 million into the state of California, it's still not enough. So unfortunately, we would have to continue with that VOCA reduction plan if nothing else happens.
So now that I made you all do math at 3:30 in the afternoon and talked about really depressing numbers, let's talk about why this is such a top priority, right? Janine, you and I see each other a lot, but we're not often on panels together talking about money. So why is this such a big deal from the state level, from the advocacy perspective?
So from the state level, it's very important because VOCA funds are historically the highest unrestricted federal funds that come into the state of California. Point blank, that's what it is. Everything that the programs need to help survivors in California is tied to VOCA. Everything that you've been doing for the last 10 years is tied to VOCA. We have to keep VOCA there some kind of way. The other federal funds, our Family Violence Prevention Services funds, they're about $12 million, and our STOP funds, which we refer to as VAWA, they're about $12 million. So when you talk, even when you talk about 87 million, even though it's not enough, it's still a lot more than those. And even those funds came in slightly lower this year. So I'm sad to say it's not a good time with these federal funds right now, and it's very important so that you all can keep your doors open and keep helping survivors in California. So.
I think it's not at all an exaggeration to say VOCA funding is life or death for many survivors. And having the conversations that we're having today, just to drive what I mean by that home, thinking about shelter access for survivors of domestic violence in high lethality situations. We think about the health consequences of not being able to get away from an abusive partner. We think about legal representation for custody cases that are essential for children who are survivors or child witnesses of domestic violence to get the safety and support that they need. We're talking about eliminating that legal advocacy and legal advice for folks, right? And looking at adverse childhood experiences and how that correlates with health for children's lifetime experiences is really critical to think about here. And we've had lots of great conversations today about that warm referral and handoff between medical care providers and domestic violence community centers. What happens when there is no one to make that warm referral to, right? The health consequences are really stark here. And VOCA funds something called UV funding, which is underserved victim funding, which funds the work that we do at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. And like I mentioned before, many survivors of marginalized identities don't feel safe or comfortable accessing mainstream organizations. And to give an example, is we had a client recently who is a trans woman. She accesses health services all the time because we're an FQHC. She comes here for her gender affirming care. She trusts the staff at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. And so when she experienced sexual violence and wasn't getting the support she needed from our law enforcement systems, she came to us for support. And we were able to provide her with legal advocacy and case management and mental health care that she needed and deserved, and they were actually able to prosecute that case and tie that perpetrator to multiple other assaults because of her participation in that case. It's life or death, as this funding is essential to the work that UV grant recipients do, and often, organizations like ours are the first ones to have to close our doors because we rely so deeply on that funding, and there's not a lot of funding out there for specialized services like ours.
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you, Janine. Okay, so let's try to end our piece on a hopeful note. So what makes both of you optimistic about our ability to preserve this funding?
For me, I think it's just all of the great advocacy efforts that your agency and all the other agencies have done, because what I see is that you're being consistent, you're finding different pots of money to say, hey, we need that money over here, and hopefully, at some point there will be ongoing funds and not just one-time funds. And we'll administer whatever you get for the state of California as fast and as efficient as possible.
I think there's two things for me. One is I've just been so deeply moved and inspired by working along amazing domestic violence advocacy warriors like Krista, who are really prioritizing the safety and well-being of LGBTQ survivors and putting that at the forefront. As we know, LGBTQ folks experience domestic violence at higher rates than non-LGBTQ folks because of structural discrimination and barriers and all of the inequities that go into what makes folks vulnerable to violence. And yet often we're sidelined, as the LGBT community has often been sidelined by the domestic violence movement. And what I've seen and experienced has been just like a galvanization and centering of survivors of marginalized identities throughout our advocacy work. So that's one. And then my other is I feel like we're having more creative conversations about how we set up survivor services funding for sustainability. Is oftentimes our movement has to operate in the scarcity mindset where we never know that the funding is stable or consistent. And so we have to, Krista put it once so good, which was we advocates will make it work with a paper clip and a rubber band, but they shouldn't have to. And I think that's so true is, we put so much on domestic violence advocates to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders for very little pay, and that's not sustainable. And then we have high rates of burnout. And so we need to talk about paying survivor advocates a living wage, a family provider wage, a wage they could afford to leave an abusive relationship on. Yes. And so we need to be able to have conversations about how we set survivor services funding up for sustainability and long-term stability and not just be in this crisis mindset. And I've been really excited and inspired to see all the creative ways we've been able to look at that as a movement.
Thank you. I'll just add, I've been inspired by all of you. Right. There's been so much activation and mobilization. So many people have showed up, spoken out. So many survivors have shared their stories about what this means. It's been so powerful. It's advocacy I wish we never had to ask you all to do, because you shouldn't have to beg for the money you need to run your programs. But it has been so powerful. The other super practical thing that inspires me and keeps me hopeful is that we've done this twice now. So we didn't mention this, but the first time Cal OES has had to ring this alarm came in 2021, in the middle of a pandemic, in a much better budget year for the state. But in April, I think it was, Cal OES said, we've got this crisis. And within 6 weeks, the governor included money in his May budget proposal, the legislature approved it, and it was in the June budget. And this year, despite a terrible state budget, over half of the assembly signed on in support of this funding. We had a ton of support in the Senate. The legislature proposed ongoing money, not just this year, not just 2 years, but ongoing. I'm not kidding you all. I thought it was a typo. I emailed budget staff just to check, because I really thought there was no way they were actually committing, $100 million ongoing. But their support was there. And the fact that it was only one time is a little disappointing. It means we got to do it again. But it was $100 million in essentially new money that the state found in a year full of budget cuts. So I know there's political will there. I know nobody wants to see the work you're doing cut. And so, I think we'll find a way. And as Amanda said, we have an amazing coalition of advocates who have been bringing so much creativity. I feel like every minute we're finding new ways to push this issue forward. So I think there's a lot of possibility, but it's going to be a little bumpy, I think, for a little while. Okay, any closing words from the two of you before we open it up for questions from the audience? Okay. Does anyone have questions?
I can just speak really loud. So you mentioned that SART is a competitive program that might receive less funding.
Yeah. So with SART not receiving as much funding, I know, like, with, like, the VAWA exams and that kind of stuff, like, it's covered by, like, the police or whatever. Like, survivors don't have to pay for that. So does that detract from, like, the ability for us to cover the care for survivors of, like, sexual assault?
Are you talking from a healthcare provider standpoint?
I guess, yeah. So I'm a advocate for survivors on my college campus. So yeah, I just want to make sure that I'm able to give people, like, information that's, like, correct, and I'm not going to be able to tell people, like, oh yeah, like, you don't have to worry about paying for that if they do.
So the program that Cal OES funds for the sexual assault response teams for the SART is more about making sure rape crisis programs are part of that multidisciplinary team that responds to victims of rape. In terms of the actual exams in the state of California, those are paid for from law enforcement, that from their own budget, separate from what Cal OES has for the SART program, for the kind of the multidisciplinary aspect of responding to survivors of rape. However, Cal OES does pay to offset anything that law enforcement doesn't pay for in terms of an exam. And so, and that's from STOP. So that's from the Services Training Officers and Prosecution Funds from the Violence Against Women Office. So that's separate, so that wouldn't be affected. However, the SART program would be affected by the reduction plan for VOCA in terms of when they go competitive, they'll have less grant subawards. Hopefully I answered that.
No, yeah, thank you.
It's a little long-winded.
It's a quiet group today, I think because it's Monday.
Right. Okay. Well, if you do have any questions that come up, our information is there, so please reach out. I know the conference organizers have our slides, so happy to have those shared with all of you. Always happy to talk about VOCA. We do a lot of it. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We want to thank our sponsors, the Blue Shield of California Foundation and the National Health Resource Center on Domestic Violence.